Listen, God is doing an amazing work in the life of our church. I don't know if you've been sensing this. There's a season of revival and renewal that we are going through right now. Last Sunday, I think David Shim already said all of this, so I'm repeating it. It's good to repeat it because it's true, and we need to let it sit. Last weekend was, the biggest Easter weekend we've ever had. This service was packed out. Then we had a successful 5 p.m. service. All the other campuses were packed out. We've been experiencing conversions after conversions in the last several months. We have been able to see the desire and interest in the people of our church to apply their faith to their emotional life. Over 120 people registered for the EHR course, and it's all making our church healthier and healthier, and it's all making the gospel more applicable in our lives, and God will continue to work through the life of Crossbridge as we continue to reach out and in the city of Miami, and out of Miami into the world as well. So I just want you to be aware that that's happening, and sometimes, it's the numbers that show us, but sometimes it's just like the move of God. Sometimes, I'm sitting in here and you're sitting in here and you're sensing the move of God. So continue to pray for the life of our church. Continue to engage. God really is at work. And because of that, we're excited that we are launching a new series of sermons. We went through the Gospel of Mark for 16 weeks, and now we're jumping into this new series, and it's a series now on the life of the Apostle Paul. And so what we're going to be doing in the next several weeks is we're going to be tracing the life of Paul through the book of Acts of the Apostles. Acts was written by Luke, the evangelist, and he becomes a traveling companion of Paul, and he writes down and he records the experience of what it means to see the gospel at work in a powerful way through the life of someone, and to see communities and cities change through that gospel at work through that person's life. So that's what Luke is doing here in the book of Acts of the Apostles. Paul was probably the most famous Christian after Jesus, is the person that has probably had the most impact in the world since Jesus Christ. Paul, since he came to faith, he became a serial church planter. What he would do is he would travel to the different cities of the Greco-Roman world, the big cities, and he would plant the gospel in these cities. And as he would plant the gospel, which is the good news about Jesus in these cities amongst people, churches were birthed. And as churches were birthed, the Apostle Paul would raise leaders. He would equip leaders in each of these churches. And then once the churches were perfectly supplied with good leaders, he would move on to a new city, to a new town, to do the same thing over and over again. Now, the beautiful thing about the Apostle Paul is that every time he left a town and he left a church equipped with leaders, he would continue to mentor and to shepherd that church through those leaders. And the way in which he would do that, he would sometimes send some of his ministry partners back into those towns to encourage them, and sometimes he would write letters. And that's why, if you're familiar with the New Testament, you know that most of the New Testament is composed of letters written by the Apostle Paul back to those churches, where he would encourage them, where he would address specific problems and some issues that were going on in their lives so that they would continue to grow as followers of Jesus Christ. And one of the metaphors that the Apostle Paul used throughout his letters, more than one way and in more than one time, was this metaphor of the Christian life as a race. He saw the Christian life as a race. So for instance, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he writes this to the church in Corinth. He says, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? so run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. He paints the Christian life as a race that we have been invited to run. In his own life, he saw his life, his journey as a race himself, that he ran towards the prize that he talks about in Philippians, which is Jesus Christ. That is a prize where he was running after it in his whole life. And so throughout this series, we're going to look at the different stages of this race in the life of the Apostle Paul, in the book of Acts of the Apostles, and each week we're going to apply something different to our lives, okay? Today, the title of the sermon is The Starting Line. Got to start with the starting line. That's the title of the sermon today. And we're going to look at the account, the first account here of Paul's own conversion, of when Paul became a Christian. Okay, in fact, before he became a Christian, his name was not Paul, his name was Saul. And we read about it in Acts chapter 8, verses 1 through 9. Okay, so just these few verses here, I'm going to invite you to read with me. If you don't have a Bible, the text is going to be on the screen, so it's going to be easy for you to follow. Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 8. This is what the Bible says, what the Word of God says out of the book of Acts. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, by the way, this is the first name that was attributed to Christians, the people of the way. That's why it's in capital W. Men or women, he may bring them bound to Jerusalem. He went to Damascus in search of Christians to bring them back to Jerusalem. Now, as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do. The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were open, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. This is the word of the Lord. So if the Christian life can be depicted as a race, if this is a valid metaphor for the Christian life, let's ask 3 questions, okay? Number 1, when does it start? And number 2, how does it start? What do we see when it starts? What are the steps that we see? And then number 3, where to start? Because some of you here today may understand when it starts and how it starts, but you don't know how to start. So that's going to be the last question. Where to start? Number 1, when does it start? It starts at conversion. A lot of people think that coming to faith in Jesus Christ sometimes is the finish line. Oh, I have arrived. And sometimes we actually correctly say to people, welcome home. It is a welcoming home. But it's not that you have arrived, you have just begun. That's the starting line. Conversion is not the finish line, but conversion is the starting line. Now I'm going to be asking here, conversion, what do you mean by conversion? What is conversion? Here's my definition of conversion, okay? I want to share this with you in a simplified way. Here's what conversion is. Conversion is restarting your life, or to restart your life bottom up with Jesus as Lord. What is conversion? Is that moment where you now are to restart your life bottom up with Jesus as Lord. And I want you to really let these words sink deep into your heart. You know why? Because there's a lot of you here today that were born Catholics, that were born Presbyterians, that were born Baptist, and you don't know one Sunday without going to church. You don't know yourself as not being a Christian, but you've never restarted your life bottom up as Jesus as Lord. You've had the faith of your parents. You've accepted the labels that they've placed on you. You like the environment of Christianity. Oh, so many nice people to hang out with. I love every Sunday just to be with the good people of this city. I get to take a break from all the bad people that I get to work with and do life with on an everyday basis, right? And you like it, and you say to people, yeah, I'm a Christian, I go to church, or yeah, I was Christian, I was baptized. Everyone has to be able to restart their lives bottom up with Jesus in order for you to enter into this race called the Christian life. And the sad thing is that there's some of you here today that never had this experience. Now, for some of you, it has been dramatic, but some of you have been subtle. Some of you has just been a penny that dropped one day when you were reading something or when you were sitting through church, or when you were reflecting while you were driving your car and you stopped at a stoplight and your mind went there, and then that penny dropped and everything made sense. It's not one size fits all, but you gotta have that moment where you are deconstructed in order to be reconstructed. I love this Christian writer by the name of Richard Rohr. He says that the life of every person consists of 3 buckets. You have construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction. Construction, the values, the environment that you're familiar with, the values that you have been handed down. You've been built up by your parents, by your community, by your society. And there's a lot of people that never leave that bucket. But the people that never leave that bucket will never be transformed, because that's the pathway of the resurrection, this sort of transformation. Jesus has to die. He has to be buried in order to be raised from the dead. People like Paul and Peter and many others, myself and you included, need to go through that process of being deconstruction, of having your values challenged and questioned. And maybe all the values that have been handed down to you and everything that was said to you and everything that was poured in on you to make you who you are today was all right, but it needs to be tested. You need to pull it apart and put it back together. But unless you are deconstructed, you cannot be put back together. And this is what Paul experiences here on the road to Damascus. Paul had a pretty good idea of who God was. He had a pretty good idea of how he should live his life, and he was going in a specific way, and Jesus met him on that road and deconstructed him. He literally fell down when Jesus had this encounter with Paul, and he now has to start from the bottom up. He is on the ground. His face is in the dirt, and he can't see anything because he opens his eyes, and he just sees shadows of things and blurry images. Demonstrating sort of, that's where my imagination when I was studying this text is, demonstrating sort of the process that every baby goes through when they come into the world. They're in darkness. When they come into the world, there's light, and they're scared at that light. They start crying at that light. And I did a little research, although I'm not a doctor or a scientist, but here's what I learned. And if you're a doctor, here it is. Pastor, what you said was outrageous during the sermon. I'll correct it next week, okay? If I remember, I will correct it. But what I read was that babies, when they open their eyes, they really can't see anything clearly. It's just a blur. Correct, doctors in the room? Yeah? Yeah? Okay, I saw about like 3 or 4 doctors saying, you're good to go, son. And it's through time, maybe after 4 days or a week, that things begin to get clearer and clearer to them. And that's the process that everyone must go through. Paul now is, because he can't see, he has to be conducted like babies, he'd be carried. He's carried into the town of Damascus. It reminds me of the conversation that Jesus had with this other famous religious guy by the name of Nicodemus, who thought he had it all together. And Jesus looks at him and says, you have money, you have respect, you have theology, you know the Bible, you're a religious man, but you must be born again. Be born again? What do you mean be born again? You must be born again. You must be rebuilt. You must be reconstructed. You must restart your life bottom up with Jesus. It's what Nicodemus had to do. It's what I had to go through in life as well. Did you know that I only really understood the gospel, that the gospel truly only made sense to me after I was a pastor? What? Yeah. Not while I was at Crossbridge, okay? Let that be said. Let that be said. I've been a pastor for 24 years, so just so you know I look young. Well, actually really old. But there was a moment that I understood the difference that grace makes, and that salvation is not by anyone's efforts or its own righteousness, but it's by relying solely on the grace of God. And the way in which you grow in faith is not through your works, but reminding yourself of how you have been saved. That, by the way, it's not unique to me. That's how Martin Luther, after being a monk and after promoting the Reformation, that's what happened to him as well. You thought that Luther was completely converted when he promoted the Reformation in 1517. He was not. He only came to an understanding of grace 2 years later after lecturing the books of the Bible. Anyone has to go through this. My daughters had to go through this. They were baptized as they were babies, but my daughters had to go through this moment of restarting their lives bottom up with Jesus. It's what Maggie shared today. Hey, I didn't ask you permission, but if you posted it on social media, it's pretty much all out, so I have a license to do that. But yesterday I had the privilege of baptizing my fitness coach, Maggie, who has come to faith here at Crossbridge in the past months. And, it's somebody that I see on a weekly basis. She is the girlfriend of my jiu-jitsu sensei, cyborg, multi-time world champion, whatever. They've been coming to church. Wait, it was my watch speaking. It was not God. And I had the privilege of baptizing her today, and I've been witnessing the transformation that God has been bringing in her life. This is literally happening in her life, restarting her life from the bottom up with Jesus as Lord. And this is what she shared today. I'm going to share this, okay, Maggie? Hold it together. She shared this. Listen, she's going to share her story one day, but this is what she shared yesterday. Tell me what you think of this. New life. To end the old way of living and start new. I didn't believe in anything but myself. I only needed me. I didn't need God. I got to the point where I wasn't able to help me. I wasn't able to find an answer or figure out what to do next. I needed something beyond what I could fix. I needed God. And now this is my testimony that I will not live without him. She posted that to some 50,000 people. But this is what I'm talking about here. Restarting your life bottom up with Jesus as Lord. Have you been through that experience? Is that a reality in your life? Oh, I've been at church. It doesn't matter. Have this happened to you? Now, here's the most encouraging piece, okay? This is what conversion looks like. This is what the starting line looks like. But there's something even more beautiful than that I need you to see this in the story. And that is that before we start, God starts. See, our starting point is this, but God's starting point is before our start. And the beautiful story that we read now in the life of Paul, now that we have the whole story, is that while Paul was running against Jesus, while Paul was running away from Jesus, Jesus was running towards Paul. He was persecuting followers of Jesus, and Jesus was running towards him. Which means this is that before I initiated anything, before Paul initiated anything, before Maggie initiated anything, Jesus was already after her. He was already after me. He was already after you. And that demonstrates the depth of his love for us. You know, one of the smartest Christians that has come to faith in history is a man by the name of C.S. Lewis. Christian writer, prolific writer in the 50s, wrote the Narnia Chronicles. There's movies done about him, sorts of things. And Lewis was an avid atheist until he came into contact with a friend from Oxford, a fellow professor by the name of J.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings. And it was through that friendship that God began to work in Lewis's life and began to mine his unbelief and his skepticism and his defenses in order to draw Lewis to him. And at one point, as he's talking to a friend, as he's processing, his personal beliefs, and he's putting them against the claims of Christianity, he says this, look, he says, this is a smart man, so an academic, so he's not going to use boxing or running as a metaphor, but he uses a chess match as a metaphor. And he says this, all over the board, my pieces were in the most disadvantageous positions. Soon, I could no longer cherish even the illusion that the initiative lay with me. My adversary began to make his final moves. Checkmate. God after him, bringing him to the corner, meeting him on the road to Damascus. And then later on, Lewis is talking to this man, a man by the name of Sheldon Vanauken. Now this is an interesting story, and you can read about Sheldon Vanauken in this book called The Severe Mercy. This is a story of Sheldon. Sheldon was married to a woman that he absolutely loved. It was the love of his life. And what he did with her was he bought a sailboat and he began to travel the world with this woman, eating in the most amazing places, drinking the most amazing wine, living life to the fullest. Yet she began corresponding with C.S. Lewis. And the worst thing that can happen to a skeptical man is when your woman, your wife, begins to love Jesus more than you. And that began to happen. And she comes to faith and that journey of theirs. And it's in that journey that she catches cancer and she ends up dying of cancer. And then Sheldon now, as a man that's filled with pain and grief, he begins now to write C.S. Lewis, who corresponded with his wife, who led his wife to faith. And he's talking about how can there be a good God if there's pain and suffering in the world? If he took her from me, how can there be a good God? And the conversation begins to progress and to progress and to progress until Lewis says this to Sheldon. Check this out. Next quote. It's coming. Not going? Well, basically, this is what he says to him. He says, you are in the web of the spider. And it's about time. Soon, shortly enough, you're going to get caught. God is already after you. You cannot run away from him. Maybe that's you here today. He is already after you. You sense it. You feel the tugging, and you have fought against it. You've been fighting against it all along because you have an image to protect. And this was the Apostle Paul. This conversion account here happens and takes place 3 times in the book of Acts. Here in chapter 9, later in chapter 22, and then later in chapter 26. Here in chapter 9, Luke is the one who narrates Paul's conversion, but the last 2, Paul himself narrates the conversion. He gives us more details. And in the one in chapter 26, you can read it later. I'm not going to pull it up. But this is what the Apostle Paul says. He says this, listen, God, when he met me on that road, he said this to me. He said, will you stop kicking against the goads? You know what goads are? Goads are these long sticks. I know we city people, we don't know what goads are, but goads are these long sticks that shepherds use in order to guide their sheep. Because sheep, they're cute animals, but they're stupid. okay? And sometimes the food is over here and the sheep are going that way. Sometimes danger is over here and the sheep is going that way, okay? And so you need these goads, and they're sort of pointy. When the sheep is going in the wrong direction, you need to stick it in their belly, and it hurts to get them to go the right way. And they're rebellious sometimes, so you got to stick them sometimes multiple times. And what God was saying to Paul in that conversion experience is, hey, I've been sticking you with the goads. Haven't you been feeling it? Stop kicking against the goads. And God is saying to you here today, stop kicking against the goads. You know I'm going to win anyways. It's just causing more pain in your life. Let's deconstruct. Let's start from bottom up with Jesus as Lord. That's win. How? How does this happen? Okay, the quote eventually came out. It's a problem in technology. Sometimes it gets stuck. It was not our team's fault. It was just technology. Let's move on. Second point, how? How does it happen? 3 things happen when this begins in your life, when this process begins in your life. The first thing that happens is that there is surrender. There is surrender. Surrender is the first thing that happens. I love the parallel and the wordplay between verses 2 and 3. In verse 2, Paul was going after the people of the way, and as he was doing that, in verse 3, he went his way, right? So he had an idea of how his life should go. He had an idea of how God wanted him to live his life. He had a type of idea of who God was, but Jesus didn't match any of that. Living a life like those early Christians lived made no sense when he tried to put that together with what he knew from his religion. It did not fit together. Things did not add up. And he honestly felt that he was doing God's work. He was utterly genuine in his persecution because he believed that little sect of the people called the Way were really poisoning their faith, was really poisoning their religion, and they needed to be brought into account. And so he stood as a moral, righteous man, and he said, I'm going to do God's work, and I'm going to rid our faith from these heretics. And so he persecuted Christians. He was going his way. And Jesus, on that road, confronted him, saying, you're going your way. That's what I see. But you're going the wrong way. You think you are running towards me. You are running away from me. You think that you are running with me. You are running on a completely different road. It's not my road. It's not the road that my people are on. It's your own road. This road that you have created. It has nothing to do with my way. And what Paul has to do is to surrender his way for God's way. And that's what every one of us need to do in order to start that race, to start that process. You need to surrender your way to God's way. He thought that his way to holiness, his way to heaven was through his own performance. And he had to surrender his own goodness and his own morality and his own righteousness for the goodness and the righteousness of Jesus Christ. He had to surrender his dreams and his plans to God's dreams and God's plans. Because sometimes one of the reasons why we hesitate jumping into this race is because, but I really love my plans. I really love my dreams. We do not trust that God has better plans, that God has better dreams for us. We do not trust that his righteousness can be any possibly better than our own, than the one we can build, than the one we have to and we can construct. And he's saying, now I recognize that that's what Jesus was doing. He was leading me to a place of surrender because I was kicking against the goads. Unless the experience was Jesus himself showing up in a glorious way on this road, I wouldn't have gotten to this point. I wouldn't have fallen down. I wouldn't have recognized. I wouldn't have reflected that my way was not really his way. My way was not the right way. My way was the wrong way. You have to come to a place of surrender. So it starts with surrender. He asks the question in verse 5, who are you, Lord? Right there, he acknowledges that he had no idea who God was. He had no idea. But he was better. I'll tell you this much, that the God that appeared to him on that road was way much better than the God that he had devoted his life to, that he thought would save him. It was a God of wrath. It was a God of condemnation. It was a God of rules. This is a God of grace, a God of love demonstrated in Jesus Christ. You have to surrender. Have you come to that point of surrendering? Secondly, there is a shift in identity. So first, how? Surrender. Secondly, there is a new identity. There's a shift in an identity. Notice that there's a name change from Saul to Paul here in the book of Acts of the Apostles. I've been calling him Paul all along, but when we read the text, he is Saul. Saul is his Jewish name. Saul is the name of the first Jewish king. If you would remember Israel's history, it was the first Israelite king was the king Saul. Saul is a Jewish name. Saul represented who Paul was, a religious Pharisee. It represented the life that he was all about, a life of religion, a life of morality. The new name that he had received now is now the Roman version of his Jewish name. So he is still very much Saul, but now he has been repurposed by Jesus. He's actually a better version of the old Saul. He is a new version of the old Saul, but now he's been repurposed by Jesus. And his name now is redefined by the mission that he has been given, that Jesus shares with him on this road and in this conversation, which is a mission to the Gentiles. It's a mission to take the gospel to the Greco-Roman world. His name now is a name that has the full depth of the calling that he has received as a follower of Jesus Christ. Because Jesus now has become the most important thing to Paul. Jesus has become his ultimate identity. And that's what it means to become a Christian. When a person truly becomes a Christian, here's how I know, is that the most important thing to them becomes Jesus. Really, really. Their identity now is shaped around Jesus and not around their work and not around their children and not around their money and not around their race and not around their orientation. Yes, we all have layers of identities in our life. And if I were to ask you, who are you? You would say, well, here's my gender. Here is my ethnicity. Here is my socioeconomic status. Here is my education. There's multiple layers to our identity. And that's fine and that's good because that makes us very diverse. That's what makes us so different and what makes humanity so beautiful. But to a Christian, your political orientation cannot become your main identity. Your race cannot become your main identity. Your accomplishments cannot become the main source of your identity. You cannot build your identity around these things. What has now become your identity is Jesus Christ and only Jesus. See, a Christian is somebody that's living off of this new identity, of God's opinion of them, of who they are, not because of anything that they've accomplished or because of any condition that they were born under, but because of that which God has done for them in Jesus. That becomes the most important thing about them. And that's why the Apostle Paul in Philippians 3, he says this about himself. Look, he says, the very credentials these people are waving around as something special, I'm tearing up and throwing out with the trash along with everything else I used to take credit for. And why? Because of Christ. Yes, all things I once thought were so important are gone from my life compared to the high privilege of knowing Christ Jesus as my master firsthand. Everything I once thought I had going for me is insignificant dog dung. Now, this isn't the Bible, but this is the Message version, okay? He's saying, all of the accomplishments in my life now are nothing compared to what it means to me to be found in Jesus Christ. Now, all of us here today are building our identity around something. And what you need to ask is my identity really shaped by who Jesus says that I am, by that which Jesus has done for me? Or I'm still pursuing my own image and my own identity and building them around these fleeting, worthless things. Is that true in your life? See, because that's how it happens. Surrender, a new identity. But then thirdly, I want you to understand that it happens as a process. It's a mistake to think that Paul's change happened overnight. It did not happen overnight. This was a process. He had an encounter with Jesus, and now he was taken into Damascus. For 3 days, he was blind, and I think that the reason why Jesus made him blind was so that he would have this cosmic timeout. Go sit on your corner and think, like we do to our kids. Go sit on your corner and think, so that he could try to reflect, so he would reflect upon the experience that he had versus all the beliefs that he had amounted throughout his life. Put one against the other. And it was a process of change. It was a process of conversion. We're going to read about this later on. There were mentors that came alongside Paul. There's a lot of things that happened, but his conversion started to happen as a process before he began to proclaim Jesus as Lord to people in Damascus, in Syria, which he did, and then later on in Jerusalem, before he began to live out his Christian faith full out. And this is what happens in most of our lives. Let me show you how this process takes place. So think about your life as this pie chart here, right? You have all these areas of your life: image, finances, relationships, spirituality, sexuality, your past and your future, your speech and your work. And usually what happens is it starts down here, right? You begin by being exposed to this idea of Jesus as God, and it starts to make sense to you. And it begins to change this compartment of your life, your spirituality. And you take this on as identity. But these other compartments of your life have been unconverted to Jesus. Okay? And that explains why there's a lot of people who call themselves Christians, but they're very harsh with others. They have a hard time forgiving people. They're very stingy people. They can't forget their past. They can't move on from their past. They're filled with shame and guilt. They're worried and anxious and stressed out about their future. It's because the gospel, the good news of Jesus, has not flooded the other compartments of your life. And what needs to happen is, in order for there to be a full conversion, there's these like gates, if you will, between each of these compartments. You need to open these gates and allow the good news of the gospel to flood all of it. See, when conversion truly happens, it's when you begin to apply that what Jesus has done for you to your relationships. He forgave me so I can forgive others. He was generous to me so I can be generous to others. I am loved and accepted by him. I don't really need the ultimate approval of others. See, it begins to convert all areas of life. Now, there's some people that start from here, right? They were doing some sort of work and it didn't pan out, didn't work out for them. They experienced utter failure and I need God. And then they start moving in this direction. And they say, I'm gonna give my work or my business to God and allow God to work. And then God begins to work here until he gets down here. But it's a process. And the reason why I want you to realize this is, number one, because you need to be patient with people that God is at work. Don't force them into faith and to belief. Nobody gets argued into faith. They get loved into faith. So be patient with others. Be patient with yourself. God is doing the work, and he will continue to do the work in your life as well. But also, I want you to realize that if you have made a profession in Jesus Christ, if you say that I'm a Christian, but all these other areas of your lives are not converted to Jesus, you need to open these gates so that all these compartments are flooded with the truth of the gospel. So that's the how. So the when, the how, lastly, where? Where do I begin? Where does it begin? And it begins where it should begin, and it ends where it should end. It begins with Jesus. See, any conversion experience that does not begin with Jesus is not an authentic conversion. It may be a step towards conversion, but if a conversion doesn't begin with you realizing who Jesus is, that he is God, that he is Lord, that he is God come to save you, to do that which you cannot do for yourself. If you don't realize, if you don't have a deep Christology, if you don't have a deep understanding of who Jesus is, if you don't realize that he's God, okay? Now, you keep growing in that understanding, but you have to have that understanding, that basic understanding that Jesus is Lord, that Jesus is God, that he is God come to save you. If it doesn't start with Jesus, it is not an authentic conversion. Paul's conversion starts with Jesus on the road to Damascus. It's Jesus first that meets him. And you know what this means for us? Listen, you need to come to a point, each of us who are Christians had to come to a point where we had to ask the question, where you will have to ask the question, is Jesus really who he said he was? That's it. And you know why this is important? Because some of us have trouble with Christianity because there's several reasons. One, the ethics of Christians are very regressive. I can't live by those ethics. Have you heard that? Secondly, Christianity is unscientific. It's not rational. It's not smart. It's all faith, you know. It goes against science. Thirdly, there are a lot of bad Christians out there. How can this be true? I take it from the bad Christians that I know, right? And I want to tell you, you're probably right in all of the above. There are times that Christianity seems regressive. There are times that there are Christians that speak stupidly, okay, that disregard science, but they don't represent all Christians, just by the way. The idea of miracles sometimes seem to contradict the law of physics. I get it. And there are a lot of bad Christians out there, and you know them. You do life with them. They are your neighbors. They are your co-workers. Sometimes they're your spouse. And you know them. And I'm not taking your reason in all of this, but what I want you to understand is don't start there. What I want to challenge you is don't start there, is be open-minded. You accuse Christians of being closed-minded. Be open-minded. Start with Jesus. Is Jesus who he said he was? Is Jesus the one that was sent by God from heaven to save us from our sins, to offer us hope of new life? Is he able really to forgive sin? Because that's the problem that Paul had. Paul had a problem with Jesus, not the way in which Christians live their lives, but he had a problem with Jesus. So you got to come to grips with Jesus. Start with Jesus. Don't start anywhere else. You'll get to the other places later, but start with Jesus. Is Jesus who he said he was? See, because the cop-out is this. It's like, I don't want to go in there because I don't want to investigate the claims because what if he is? And so we rather sometimes call Jesus, and I see a lot of non-Christian friends of mine say this, he was a great teacher, he was a great master, he was an inspiration and an enlightened spirit, but God in the flesh, I'm not sure about that. And the reason for that cop-out is because you don't really want to look into the claims that Jesus made about himself. See, this is what Lewis says. I'm doing a lot of Lewis today. It's a famous question from Lewis, and I'm going to end pretty soon. He says, I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish things that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. So is he who he said he is? And if he is, if Jesus, in fact, in your pursuit, in your encounter with him, if he is in fact who he said he was, then you know what that means? That he's inviting you to this race. that he's saying you cannot stay out of it. We will not start without you. You need to run this race. Now, there's some of you that may hear this invitation for the very first time today, and there's some of you here today that have started that race and you veered off and now you're running a different race and you're saying, hey, it's time to come back. It's time to return. Come run with us. This is what the Christian life is all about. You started with me. You wandered away from me. Time to restart with me. Let's start or restart that race today. You pray with me.